On the morning of November 14th, 1994, a Boeing 727 cargo aircraft operating as Flight NCL 801 landed at Miami International Airport with three crew members, 14,000 pounds of freight, and a fuel discrepancy that should not have existed. According to the aircraft's fuel management system, the flight had consumed approximately 1,800 pounds less fuel than the route profile indicated it should have. The flight had departed San Juan, Puerto Rico 2 hours and 41 minutes earlier. The filed flight plan estimated 2 hours and 53 minutes. The aircraft landed 12 minutes ahead of schedule. The captain reported normal flight conditions throughout. Air traffic control recorded no deviations. But when maintenance personnel in Miami performed a routine post-flight fuel calculation, they found that the numbers did not reconcile with the distance flown, the reported airspeed, or the logged flight time. The discrepancy was noted in the maintenance log and forwarded to the operations department. It would be 3 days before anyone realized the implications. The flight had been unremarkable in every other respect. NCL 801 was a regularly scheduled cargo route, operated 5 days per week by National Cargo Lines, a Miami-based freight carrier with a fleet of 12 aircraft. The 727 in question, registration number November 739er Charlie Lima, had been in service since 1982 and had accumulated just over 38,000 flight hours. It was maintained to FAA standards and had passed its most recent airworthiness inspection 6 weeks prior. The crew consisted of Captain Raymond Hollis, a former Air Force pilot with 22 years of commercial experience, First Officer Daniel Mercer, and Flight Engineer Carl Pritchard. All three were qualified on type and current on their medical certifications. The cargo manifest listed electronics components, pharmaceutical shipments, and mail. Total weight at departure was 162,000 pounds, well within operational limits. The route from San Juan to Miami is one of the most heavily trafficked corridors in the Caribbean. It crosses approximately 980 nautical miles of open water, passing through multiple air traffic control sectors and over a region known for high traffic density, variable weather, and complex airspace. National Cargo Lines flight crews flew this route regularly. The standard operating procedure was straightforward. Departure from San Juan's Luis Muñoz Marine International Airport, climb to flight level 330, proceed northwest along airway Amber 556, then transition to the Miami Air Route Traffic Control Center frequency, descend per ATC instructions, and land on runway 27 at Miami International. The flight plan filed that morning estimated a total time en route of 2 hours and 53 minutes, based on forecast winds and standard cruise speed. Fuel loaded at San Juan was 22,400 pounds. This included the trip fuel, reserves, alternate fuel for Fort Lauderdale, and additional contingency fuel, as required by company policy. The numbers had been calculated by dispatch and verified by Captain Hollis before departure. NCL 801 pushed back from the gate at Luis Muñoz Marine at 6:42 local time. The flight departed runway 10 at 6:58. Initial climb was normal. The aircraft checked in with San Juan departure control and was cleared to flight level 330. At 7:14, NCL 801 reported level at cruise altitude and was handed off to San Juan Center. The weather was clear. Visibility was greater than 10 miles. Winds aloft were light and variable, within 2 knots of the forecast. The flight proceeded northwest on the assigned airway. First Officer Mercer was pilot flying. Captain Hollis monitored systems and communications. Flight Engineer Pritchard managed engine parameters and fuel status. All three crew members later described the flight as routine. At 7:41, NCL 801 checked in with Miami Center on frequency 132.45. The controller acknowledged and issued a clearance to maintain flight level 330. The flight was approximately 400 nautical miles southeast of Miami at that time. Captain Hollis acknowledged the clearance and read back the altitude. The controller copied. There was no indication of any irregularity. The radar return from NCL 801 appeared on the controller's scope as expected, displaying the aircraft's transponder code, altitude, and ground speed. The data block showed the call sign, flight level 330, and a ground speed of 471 knots. The aircraft was on course and on schedule. The controller's attention shifted to other traffic in the sector. NCL 801 continued northwest. At 7:53, the controller responsible for the sector noticed something unusual. The radar return for NCL 801 was still present on his scope, but the data block had changed. The transponder code was no longer displayed. Instead, the system was showing the aircraft as a primary target only, identified by its radar reflection rather than its transponder signal. This meant the aircraft was still visible on radar, but the automatic identification system had stopped receiving a transponder reply. The controller attempted to verify the aircraft's transponder setting. He keyed his microphone and called NCL 801, asking the crew to confirm their transponder was set to the assigned code and mode Charlie. Captain Hollis responded immediately. He confirmed the transponder was on, set to the correct code, and indicating normal on the flight deck. The controller acknowledged and made a note. He assumed the issue was a temporary equipment malfunction, either on the ground or in the aircraft. Primary radar contact was solid. The aircraft's position and track were consistent with its filed flight plan. He continued to monitor. For the next 6 minutes, NCL 801 appeared on the controller's radar scope as a primary target only. No transponder data was received. The radar return moved steadily northwest at approximately the same ground speed as before. The controller tracked the flight manually and coordinated with adjacent sectors to ensure separation from other traffic. At 7:59, the transponder signal from NCL 801 reappeared. The data block returned to normal, showing the correct code, altitude, and ground speed. The controller noted the time and called the flight again, asking if they had experienced any electrical issues or if they had cycled the transponder. Captain Hollis replied that they had not. He stated that all systems were operating normally and that they had no indications of any malfunction. The controller acknowledged and continued to handle the flight as routine. The transponder signal remained stable for the remainder of the flight. NCL 801 began its descent at 8:27 and was cleared to flight level 240. The aircraft was handed off to Miami Approach Control at 8:33. Approach cleared the flight for further descent and vectored it for an approach to runway 27. At 8:38, NCL 801 was cleared for a visual approach. The aircraft landed at 8:39. Total flight time was 2 hours and 41 minutes. The crew taxied to the cargo ramp, completed the shutdown checklist, and secured the aircraft. Captain Hollis signed the flight log and noted no discrepancies. The aircraft was turned over to ground personnel for unloading and servicing. The crew filed their post-flight paperwork and departed the airport. Everything appeared normal. The fuel discrepancy was discovered during the routine post-flight servicing. A ramp supervisor named Victor Salazar was responsible for coordinating refueling operations for National Cargo Line's aircraft at Miami. His procedure was to verify the fuel quantity indicated on the aircraft's fuel panel, compare it to the expected remaining fuel based on the flight plan, and calculate the amount needed to bring the aircraft to the required level for the next departure. When he approached November 739er Charlie Lima that morning, he performed the standard checks. The fuel gauges indicated 8,100 pounds remaining. According to the flight plan, the aircraft should have consumed approximately 14,300 pounds during the flight from San Juan, leaving approximately 8,100 pounds. The numbers matched. Salazar authorized the refueling and moved on to other tasks. Later that afternoon, Salazar received a call from the operations department. A dispatcher had reviewed the fuel log and noticed something inconsistent. The flight plan for NCL 801 had been calculated based on a trip time of 2 hours and 53 minutes. The actual flight time was 2 hours and 41 minutes. This meant the aircraft had arrived 12 minutes early. Under normal conditions, arriving early would suggest either a stronger tailwind than forecast or a higher cruise speed than planned. Either scenario would result in higher fuel consumption, not lower. But the fuel remaining on the aircraft matched the expected quantity, as if the flight had lasted the full planned duration. Salazar was asked to verify the fuel readings. He returned to the aircraft and rechecked the gauges. The reading was consistent with what he had recorded earlier. He reported this back to operations. The dispatcher, a man named Thomas Reeves, had been with National Cargo Lines for 9 years. He was familiar with the San Juan to Miami route and had calculated fuel burns for it hundreds of times. The numbers for NCL 801 did not make sense to him. He pulled the weather data for the time of the flight and confirmed that the winds aloft had been light and close to forecast. There had been no significant tailwind that would account for the early arrival. He checked the filed cruise speed and confirmed it matched the standard profile for a 727 at that weight and altitude. He reviewed the flight log submitted by Captain Hollis. The log indicated a cruise Mach number of 0.78, which was consistent with the flight plan. Reeves calculated the expected fuel burn using the actual flight time of 2 hours and 41 minutes. The result indicated the aircraft should have consumed approximately 15,900 pounds of fuel, not 14,300. This meant there was a shortfall of approximately 1,600 pounds. The aircraft had used less fuel than the distance and time would require. Reeves made a note in the flight file and forwarded the information to the chief pilot's office. Chief pilot Gerald Moss reviewed the file the following morning. Moss had been a line captain with National Cargo Lines before moving into management. He understood aircraft performance and fuel planning. The discrepancy in NCL 801's fuel log concerned him, but he also knew that fuel calculations were subject to variables. Instrument error, calibration drift, or incorrect wind data could all produce anomalies. He decided to interview the crew. Captain Hollis, First Officer Mercer, and Flight Engineer Pritchard were scheduled for a layover in Miami and were contacted by phone. All three agreed to meet with Moss at the operations office. The interview took place on the afternoon of November 15th. Moss asked the crew to walk him through the flight from departure to landing. Captain Hollis described the departure from San Juan as normal. He confirmed that the aircraft had climbed without incident and reached cruise altitude at the expected time. He stated that the en route portion of the flight was uneventful. The weather was good. There were no system malfunctions. The only irregularity he recalled was the controller asking them to verify their transponder setting. Hollis said he had checked the transponder panel and found it set correctly. He assumed there had been a brief equipment glitch, either with the ground radar or the aircraft's transponder. The signal had returned to normal within a few minutes. He did not consider it significant. First Officer Mercer corroborated the captain's account. He added that he had monitored the ground speed readout during cruise and that it had remained consistent with the flight plan around 470 knots. He noted that the flight had landed slightly ahead of schedule, but he attributed this to efficient routing by ATC and the lack of delays in the terminal area. He did not recall any unusual indications on the flight instruments. Flight Engineer Pritchard provided more detail. As the crew member responsible for monitoring fuel status, he had tracked the fuel burn throughout the flight. He stated that the fuel flow meters had indicated normal consumption rates during all phases of flight. He confirmed that the fuel quantity gauges had been checked at top of climb, at intervals during cruise, and again during descent. All readings had been within expected parameters. He said he had noted the fuel remaining at landing, and it matched the calculated value based on the fuel loaded at San Juan and the expected burn. He had no explanation for why the actual burn would be lower than the calculated burn for the flight time and distance. Moss asked Pritchard if there was any possibility of instrument error. Pritchard replied that the fuel gauges on the 727 were generally reliable and that the aircraft had not shown any history of fuel quantity indication problems. He added that the fuel flow meters and quantity gauges were independent systems, and that both would have to malfunction in a consistent way to produce the observed discrepancy. He considered this unlikely. Moss thanked the crew and dismissed them. He reviewed his notes. The crew's testimony was consistent and credible. They had not observed any significant anomalies during the flight. The transponder issue had been brief and had resolved itself. The fuel quantity at landing had matched the expected value based on the flight plan, but the actual flight time had been shorter than planned, and there was no obvious explanation for why the fuel burn had not increased proportionally. Moss considered several possibilities. He thought about instrument calibration error, incorrect fuel load data from San Juan, or an error in the flight plan calculations. None of these seemed likely. He decided to escalate the matter. On November 16th, Moss contacted the FAA Flight Standards District Office in Miami and reported the fuel discrepancy. He provided copies of the flight plan, the fuel log, the crew statements, and his own analysis. The FAA assigned an inspector named Laura Dietrich to review the case. Dietrich had 14 years of experience with the agency and specialized in aircraft performance and operations. She examined the documentation and requested additional data. She obtained the air traffic control recordings for NCL 801's flight, the radar track data from Miami Center, and the maintenance records for November 739er Charlie Lima. She also requested the weather data and winds aloft forecast for the time and route of the flight. Dietrich's initial review confirmed that the fuel discrepancy was real. The aircraft had departed San Juan with 22,400 pounds of fuel. It had landed in Miami with 8,100 pounds remaining. This meant it had consumed 14,300 pounds. Based on the actual flight time of 2 hours and 41 minutes, the expected consumption should have been approximately 15,900 pounds. The shortfall was 1,600 pounds. Dietrich calculated that this difference represented roughly 10 minutes of flight time at normal cruise fuel flow. She began to look for explanations. One possibility was that the flight had not actually lasted 2 hours and 41 minutes. Dietrich examined the ATC recordings and radar data. The departure time from San Juan was recorded by tower control as 6:58. The landing time at Miami was recorded by tower control as 8:39. The elapsed time was 2 hours and 41 minutes. This was consistent with the flight log. Dietrich then examined the radar track data from Miami Center. The data showed NCL 801's position at 1-minute intervals throughout the en route portion of the flight. She calculated the distance traveled and the average ground speed. The ground speed was consistent with the flight plan and matched the speed reported by the crew. The distance covered matched the filed route. There was no indication that the aircraft had flown a shorter route or that the flight time had been miscalculated. Dietrich then turned her attention to the transponder anomaly. The radar data from Miami Center showed that NCL 801's transponder signal had disappeared from the system at 7:53 and had reappeared at 7:59. During that 6-minute period, the aircraft had been tracked by primary radar only. Dietrich reviewed the position data for that period. The primary radar returns showed the aircraft continuing on its filed route at a consistent speed. There was no indication of a significant deviation in course or altitude. The track was smooth and continuous. When the transponder signal returned, the aircraft was in the expected position based on its previous track. Dietrich noted that the transponder outage had occurred approximately midway through the flight and had lasted 6 minutes. She found no technical explanation for why the transponder would stop transmitting and then resume without any crew action. Dietrich requested that the aircraft be inspected. On November 18th, an FAA-certified maintenance technician examined November 739er Charlie Lima at Miami International. The technician tested the transponder system, the fuel quantity indication system, and the fuel flow meters. All systems tested within normal parameters. The transponder responded correctly to interrogation signals and transmitted the correct codes. The fuel gauges matched the actual fuel quantity as measured by dipstick. The fuel flow meters were calibrated and accurate. The technician found no evidence of malfunction or failure. The aircraft was released back to service. Dietrich compiled her findings into a report. She concluded that the fuel discrepancy was unexplained, but not indicative of any safety issue. She noted that the aircraft's systems had been tested and found to be functioning correctly. She acknowledged that the transponder outage was unusual, but stated that it had not affected the safe operation of the flight. She recommended that national cargo lines continue to monitor the aircraft for any further anomalies. The report was filed with the FAA on November 22, 1994. No further action was taken. National cargo lines continued to operate November 739er Charlie Lima on scheduled routes. The aircraft flew without incident for the next 3 months. During that time, the fuel logs were reviewed closely. No further discrepancies were noted. The transponder system functioned normally. The crew members who had flown NCL 801 on November 14th continued their regular schedules. Captain Hollis flew the San Juan to Miami route multiple times in subsequent weeks. He reported no unusual occurrences. In early February 1995, a researcher named Dr. Martin Kellerman contacted National Cargo Lines. Kellerman was an associate professor of atmospheric physics at the University of Miami. He had been reviewing radar data from the National Weather Service and had noticed an anomaly on November 14, 1994, in the same general area where NCL 801 had experienced its transponder outage. Kellerman explained that the weather radar had detected a brief, intense return at approximately 7:54 that morning. The return had appeared suddenly, lasted less than 2 minutes, and then dissipated. It had not corresponded to any weather system or precipitation. Kellerman had flagged it as a possible equipment malfunction or atmospheric phenomenon. When he cross-referenced the time and location with FAA radar data, he found that it coincided with the position of NCL 801. Kellerman requested permission to review the flight data and interview the crew. National Cargo Lines declined, citing privacy concerns and company policy. Kellerman then contacted the FAA. Inspector Dietrich reviewed Kellerman's findings and agreed to meet with him. Kellerman presented his analysis, which included radar images, timestamps, and position coordinates. He argued that the radar return had been too strong and too localized to be a weather phenomenon or equipment error. He suggested it might have been caused by an atmospheric disturbance of unknown origin, possibly related to unusual ionospheric conditions or electromagnetic activity. He noted that the timing of the return matched the period when NCL 801's transponder had stopped transmitting. Dietrich asked Kellerman if he had any data on the atmospheric conditions at the time. Kellerman provided upper air soundings and satellite imagery from the area. The data showed normal conditions. There were no thunderstorms, no unusual wind shear, and no ionospheric disturbances recorded by monitoring stations. Kellerman acknowledged this, but pointed out that certain transient phenomena might not be detected by standard monitoring equipment. He requested access to the aircraft's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder. Dietrich informed him that the 727 in question was not equipped with a flight data recorder that captured high-resolution data. The cockpit voice recorder had been overwritten during subsequent flights and was no longer available. Kellerman's inquiry did not result in any official follow-up. The FAA took no additional action. Kellerman published a brief summary of his findings in a university technical report, but it received little attention. He moved on to other research projects. The matter was not revisited. In June 1995, a cargo pilot named Stephen Torres was reviewing flight logs at National Cargo Lines as part of a training exercise. Torres was preparing to upgrade to captain and was required to audit historical flight data as part of his qualification process. He came across the file for NCL 801 on November 14, 1994. He noticed the fuel discrepancy and the transponder anomaly. He also noticed something that had not been highlighted in any previous analysis. The radar data from Miami Center showed that during the 6-minute period when the transponder was not transmitting, the primary radar returns indicated that NCL 801 had traveled approximately 51 nautical miles. Torres calculated the average ground speed during that period. It was approximately 510 knots. This was 30 to 40 knots, faster than the speed recorded before and after the transponder outage. Torres brought this to the attention of the operations department. The calculation was reviewed by the flight dispatch team. They confirmed Torres's analysis. The ground speed during the transponder outage had been significantly higher than the cruise speed during the rest of the flight. They recalculated the fuel burn using the higher speed. The result was that the fuel consumption during that 6-minute period should have been higher than normal, not lower. This deepened the discrepancy. If the aircraft had been traveling faster during part of the flight, it should have consumed more fuel overall, not less. The operations department forwarded the updated analysis to the FAA. Inspector Dietrich reviewed the new information. She re-examined the radar data and confirmed the ground speed calculation. She noted that primary radar data could be subject to errors due to various factors, including antenna rotation rate, signal processing delays, and atmospheric refraction. She considered the possibility that the higher ground speed reading was an artifact of the radar system, rather than a reflection of the aircraft's actual speed. She contacted the Miami Center radar maintenance supervisor and requested a review of the radar calibration records for November 14, 1994. The records showed that the radar system had been operating within normal parameters and had passed all diagnostic tests. The supervisor stated that while primary radar data was less precise than transponder data, a systematic error of 30 to 40 knots over multiple position reports was unlikely. Dietrich requested a second technical evaluation of the fuel data. She asked an independent aviation consultant to review the flight profile, the fuel calculations, and the radar data. The consultant, a former airline captain and fuel planning specialist named Robert Sinclair, spent 2 weeks analyzing the case. His report, dated August 3, 1995, concluded that the fuel discrepancy could not be explained by any conventional factors. He noted that the aircraft had traveled the expected distance, had landed on schedule despite being 12 minutes early according to the flight plan, and had consumed significantly less fuel than the physics of flight would require. He stated that the only scenario that could account for all the observed data was if the aircraft had somehow covered the distance in less time than the clocks indicated, or if it had been subjected to conditions that dramatically reduced aerodynamic drag. He acknowledged that neither scenario was consistent with known atmospheric or mechanical phenomena. He concluded that the case was anomalous and unresolved. Sinclair's report was filed with the FAA but was not made public. Dietrich closed her investigation and noted in her final summary that the flight had been conducted safely, that the aircraft had been inspected and found to be airworthy, and that no violations of regulations had occurred. She recommended no further action. The file was archived. In the years following the incident, November 739er Charlie Lima continued to operate for National Cargo Lines. It accumulated thousands of additional flight hours and flew the San Juan to Miami route dozens of times. No similar discrepancies were reported. The aircraft was eventually retired from service in 2003 and sold to a leasing company. It was later converted to a training airframe and placed in storage. The crew members went on to fly other routes in other aircraft. Captain Hollis retired in 2001. First Officer Mercer moved to a major passenger airline. Flight engineer Pritchard left the industry in 1998. None of them spoke publicly about the flight. The radar return detected by Dr. Kellerman was never explained. No subsequent returns of similar intensity or character were recorded in that area. Weather Service personnel reviewed the data and concluded it was likely an equipment anomaly, though no specific cause was identified. Kellerman himself published no further analysis. His technical report remained a footnote in university archives. In 2007, a journalist researching unexplained aviation incidents came across a reference to NCL 801 in an FAA database. The journalist contacted former Inspector Dietrich, who by that time had retired from the agency. Dietrich confirmed the basic facts of the case, but declined to speculate on its cause. She stated that the FAA had investigated thoroughly and had found no evidence of equipment failure, crew error, or procedural violation. She emphasized that the flight had been safe and that the crew had acted professionally. When asked what she believed had caused the fuel discrepancy, she said she did not know. She added that there were many things in aviation that could not be fully explained with available data, and that the absence of an explanation did not imply that something extraordinary had occurred. The journalist also contacted Captain Hollis. Hollis agreed to a brief phone interview. He said he remembered the flight clearly. He confirmed that everything had seemed normal to the crew. He said the transponder issue had been momentary and that he had not given it much thought at the time. When asked about the fuel discrepancy, he said he had learned about it only after the flight and that he had trusted the investigators to determine the cause. He said he had no personal explanation for it. He noted that in 22 years of flying, he had seen many technical anomalies that were never fully resolved, and that this was simply one of them. He declined to speculate further. The journalist attempted to contact First Officer Mercer and Flight Engineer Pritchard, but was unable to locate them. National Cargo Lines had ceased operations in 2005, and its records had been transferred to a successor company. The journalist requested access to the flight logs and maintenance records for November 739er Charlie Lima, but was told that the records had been purged in accordance with retention policies. The story was never published. The journalist moved on to other projects. The case of NCL 801 remained an obscure entry in a database that few people accessed. In reviewing the available documentation, several facts remain undisputed. On November 14, 1994, a Boeing 727 flew from San Juan, Puerto Rico, to Miami, Florida. It departed on time and landed 12 minutes early. It covered the expected distance. It consumed 1,600 pounds less fuel than the route and time should have required. During a 6-minute period midway through the flight, its transponder stopped transmitting, and primary radar indicated a ground speed higher than its filed cruise speed. The aircraft's systems were inspected and found to be functioning correctly. The crew reported no anomalies. The weather was normal. No explanation was found. The discrepancy represents approximately 10 minutes of flight time that is unaccounted for. If the aircraft had covered the distance in the log time, it should have consumed more fuel. If it had consumed the logged fuel, it should have taken longer to cover the distance. The radar data indicates the aircraft was where it should have been when it should have been there, but the fuel data indicates it should not have been possible. These facts do not reconcile. There is a moment during every investigation when the available evidence is exhausted, and the questions that remain cannot be answered with the tools at hand. The case of NCL 801 reached that moment in the summer of 1995. The aircraft was airworthy. The crew was qualified. The flight was completed safely, but somewhere over the Western Atlantic, between San Juan and Miami, for a period of 6 minutes during which no transponder signal was received, something occurred that left a discrepancy in the numbers. The clocks, the fuel gauges, and the radar data tell a story that does not fully align. The distance was covered. The time was recorded. The fuel was measured. All three cannot be simultaneously correct, yet all three were. If you follow aviation mysteries and unexplained incidents, subscribe for future investigations.